Oh, because
Are you ready,
we have
Len?
the mics.
All right, we are ready.
You might?
Yep.
All right.
So between you.
Hello. Thank you for coming in the middle of a blizzard. But since we had our Madison and Green Bay DNR people already here, we figured we'd go ahead. And since Laddie's recording this, people will be able to watch it online. If you need the website, we can give that to you so you can relay it to people. I am Mariah Good. I'm the director of the Door County Land Use Services Department.
Sue Vanden Langenberg, I'm one of the zoning administrators.
And I'm Michelle Staff, and I'm from Madison, and I am the DNR Floodplain Manager Coordinator, and I'm also the National Flood Insurance Coordinator for the state of Wisconsin.
I'm Miles Winkler with the DNR. I'm their regional floodplain engineer, and I work with Door County and off and on. So.
All right. So all four of us are going to be presenting, so there's going to be some shuffling around. Would ask, if at all possible, that you hold questions until the end. We have a lot of material to get through, and a lot of it is background and might seem potentially like unnecessary detail, but I think if you let us get through everything and get to the end, hopefully a lot of your questions will be answered, and then we'll have time at the end for questions. And after we've wrapped up the main part of the meeting, if you have questions about your individual property or want us to help you, show you how to pull it up on a computer, we've got 2 different computers set up, so we can do that for you as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Michelle. Oh, and I forgot to introduce, we do have our other 2 county administrators, county zoning administrators in the room, Rick Brower and Jeff Cuso here as well. But I'm going to turn it over to Michelle now, and she's going to start the presentation part.
Okay, thanks. You can start. So part of this mapping process is through FEMA, and basically we're here today to kind of give you a background, as Mariah said, of what's going to be happening in this mapping process. But I just wanted to kind of make you aware of DNR, as same as you, does not have a lot of say in this mapping process. And when I mean say, we're not doing it, FEMA is, but we do have engineers and we do have people on staff that is, following it, and they can explain it better. And the county already sent some comments about the mapping process. We started with the work maps. And this is not your only opportunity for a public to come out here. Through the FEMA mapping process, there will be another public hearing in the preliminary stage where you can also comment and have those comments directly to FEMA. I just wanted you to be aware of that. Let's start with just the basic, go back. Thank you. With floodplain, and it's commonly known as the 100-year floodplain, but that's kind of not what it is. It's the 1% annual chance. So what that means is that in every given year, there's a 1% chance that we are going to hit those flood levels. And in a 30-year mortgage, that's probably a 26% chance that that property will flood. So that's why they call it the high flood hazard area, is because of that chance. It doesn't mean it happens at every 100 years, and that's a misconception throughout the community that, oh, it flooded last year, I'm going to be good for another year. As we know, it may continue to flood. You just never know when that chance, that 1% chance will come. So kind of understanding your flood risk. Obviously, flooding is the #1 disaster in the United States. I have attached there from NOAA all the flooding events in the state, and you might not be able to see it, and hopefully we'll have the slides available online.
They already are.
Okay, so you can see each county. Obviously, some counties are hit higher in flooding events than other counties, and Door County is the blue one of the lesser one that has been hit with flooding events. But as we can tell from the 2016 flooding in Iron County and Saxon Harbor, it doesn't matter if you get a lot of flooding, it is devastating no matter when it happens. So just kind of an overview of that. And so kind of interpreting the maps. This is just a map I picked out here, and there's different levels of risk, and the maps are supposed to depict those level of risk for the insurance. The maps were first done for insurance purposes, and so you have the low risk, which is, we call it the zone X, and it's the unshaded area, so it's the areas, no, unshaded.
Here, I'll let you.
Okay. like the areas out here. And then we have the moderate risk, which is the shaded, the X zone with the shaded, which is these black with the dots. And then we have the high risk, which is the special flood hazard areas, which are the blue areas. And then this map also shows some more detail. You don't see this on the Great Lakes, but we also see this in riverine situations with floodways in between here. So those are kind of the zones and what they mean. In the blue area, you can have mostly their zone A's, but as we're going to be discussing a little later, Door County is going to get a new zone called a Zone V. So just to kind of give you a background of what happens. So FEMA is the oversight of the floodplain, the National Floodplain Program, but they basically do all the insurance. They also do all the mapping. But at the regulatory, that comes down to the local communities. And in this example, we put Door County, but it could be, City of Sturgeon Bay. It comes down to the local level, and all the regulatory power in that aspect comes down to the local level, and they're the ones enforcing and administrating the ordinances. So just to give you an overview of the National Flood Insurance Program, it's basically a voluntary program. So it is not required to be in the program. With that being said, we do have some state floodplain regulations. We have them in an administrative code, NR 116. So if you weren't in the program, we do have some oversight at the state level. But it is a voluntary program, and FEMA makes that very clear. It is a mutual agreement between FEMA and the local community. So it's not with DNR, it's with the local community. And when you go into the program, you're signing off that you agree to adopt and enforce the floodplain regulations. Now at the DNR, one of my duties is to have a model ordinance that has both federal and state regulations together, so it's easy for you to get into the program by just adopting that model ordinance, which has minimum state standards and minimum federal standards. But you're agreeing to, that's what you're agreeing to when you sign the line. And then in exchange for that, FEMA is going to offer flood insurance to your residences. They're also going to give you some federal disaster aids, depending on if you're in the National Flood Insurance or not. You're eligible for FEMA hazard mitigation grants. What that means is that if you have some high-risk properties that you would like to mitigate, either take out of the floodplain or elevate, there's a way for you to do that with FEMA funds if you're in the program. And then what happens is why this program is around is that we're trying to manage development in the high-risk areas to basically have practices, construction practices that reduce flood losses and the high costs associated with flooding on all levels of government. So a local level, a state level, and a national level. Obviously last year was a big flood disasters for the country, and all that money, we're trying to reduce those costs. I forgot to tell you before I started that I work for Jefferson County, so I'm familiar with county government, and if anyone's familiar with Jefferson County, we're between Madison and Milwaukee and Waukesha, and we had a lot of floods, and we had the 2008 flood, if anyone hears that. So I have experienced on a local level how that affects the community, so just to give you a background on that. As I kind of explained before, there's different branches of FEMA and the National Flood Insurance Program. We call it NFIP for short, federal government, state government. We like acronyms. I do have a list of acronyms that if you picked up at the front, you can kind of follow, but the NFIP is 3 branches: the insurance, the mapping, and then the floodplain management. So that's the 3 branches there. And then that's okay, flood mitigation comes in, and flood mitigation is kind of with the floodplain management, and that happens after natural disasters, and then they do have some pre-disasters before. They have some grants beforehand too. I'm not going to go through this all, but just to give you an idea, and I kind of explain it, the federal role is the mapping portion of it. The federal role is also the insurance portion of it. They inform and educate the public too, and they provide technical assistance. So if you called them, you can get some answers from them, but they're going to tell you about federal standards. Then there's the DNR role. We, as I kind of alluded to, do have NR 116, which is our regulatory administrative code for floodplain management. We basically conduct community assistance visits with communities to evaluate their floodplain management programs, and FEMA is a partner with the DNR with that. I have been to Door County, and we did have a visit in last year, I believe. And I just want to say they do an excellent job here at Door County, and I'm not just saying that. I've been to many communities, and great permitting and great floodplain management program. We provide the model ordinance for the communities to adopt, and then we educate and inform the public about flood risk. And then the local role, as I kind of explained before, they're actually the enforcement and the administration. They do the permit development, so we don't do any permits at FEMA or DNR. And they will provide the flood hazard determination, so if you want to know where you are on that map, you can contact your local community and Sue or any of the zoning administrations, and can tell you what your risk is. And they do the field inspections, and they rectify any violations that may happen. So very briefly, I'm just going to give you a little background about flood insurance. Flood insurance is separate from floodplain management. It's separate from the mapping, but they all come together. And so you have to kind of know a little bit about each to put all the puzzles pieces together. So really quickly, I'm going to tell you a little bit about flood insurance in relationship to the maps that are coming out. So I don't know how many people are here that may be affected by the maps, but we're going to go through some scenarios. If you can advance it too. These are some quick facts about flood insurance. Flood damage is not covered by your homeowner's insurance. Okay? I will say that again. If you have homeowner's insurance, it's not covering flooding events. You can buy flood insurance no matter what risk you are at. That's another myth, is that I only can buy flood insurance if I'm in the floodplain. That is not correct. You can buy flood insurance if you're outside of the floodplain, and guess what? It's at a reduced cost to you. So you can get the benefits of the flood insurance and pay less. And that's what the preferred risk policy is called. And if you go to your insurance agent and you ask them about, I would like to get flood insurance, and you can ask them for the preferred risk policy. And they should know that, and hopefully they do. It's easy to get. Just go to your insurance agent and they'll write you a policy. There are insurance agents that are more familiar with flood insurance policies than others. I will say that. And I just said that, and it can cover contents too. There's coverage for your building, and there's coverage for your contents. And there's a 30-day waiting period. And this is interesting because when I first came into this program, I said, oh, there's a 30-day waiting period. Why is that? It was because of, I believe it was in the 90s with the Mississippi River. It started to flood up in Minnesota and come down, and down in New Orleans, they were out there buying flood insurance. I saw it recently with the Orville Dam out in California. They had once the dam might break, they had a big spur of people interested in flood insurance, but you have a 30-day waiting period. So you have to know ahead of time before you get it. It's kind of like car insurance. You never know when you're going to get in your accident. So these are the things that may happen with the map changing. So one scenario, you may be newly mapped in the high-risk area. And when I mean high-risk area, I mean the floodplain that is depicted on the maps. You may be removed from the high-risk area. You may change your zone in your high-risk area. As I said, there's a new VE zone, so you may come from a zone A to a VE zone. Your BFE may change. What that means is that 1% chance elevation may change to a higher elevation, or it may change to a lower elevation.
And BFE meaning base flood elevation.
And that's that 1% chance. Thank you. And there may be no change. You may be the same as you were before. And I don't know how many people are here that are affected by the coastal. I should have made this clear. The maps will be changing in the coastal areas and 3 lakes.
Correct. And they told us to look for these maps coming approximately 18 months to 2 years from now. So there is still a time period for us to wait for those coming.
Yep. So if you are inland, your maps may not be changing at all. So for insurance purposes, there is a newly mapped procedure that happened after April 1st of 2015. So what that means is if you're newly mapped in, you have the opportunity to get flood insurance 12 months after the effective date of the map. So that is when, on the maps, there's an effective date. And when the final maps come out, there's a 6-month period for the county to adopt them. And once that 6-month period is done, they're effective. And so after that 6 months period and they're effective, you have another year to go out to contact your insurance agent to get flood insurance. If you don't, you missed it. And what you miss is that they do have some lower rates for newly mapped in properties, and then they will bring you up to the actual rate. So that is one thing you should talk to your insurance agent about if you're going to be newly mapped in. These post-firm, what post-firm means is that the building was constructed before the county became a part of the National Flood Insurance Program. It's on the firm maps. So I don't know that. 70s?
82?
82? Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. It comes. So when that so it was built after that. You may qualify for some grandfathering. We'll talk about that in the next slide. And pre-firm building means that the structure, as it kind of says, was built before that date when the county became in. Firm stands for Flood Insurance Rate Map. So that is the maps we're discussing, and we have some draft ones, but they're not even preliminary, so that they'll look like I showed you earlier in the slides.
And just to interject, as Michelle had said earlier, these flood insurance rate maps, they're used both by the regulatory authority, Door County, when we issue our zoning permits, also the insurance, and they're all looking at the same flood insurance rate maps.
Yep. And then there's grandfathering, which basically I talked about is where it sat before, it sat there before the maps changed in compliance, and that's the last bullet point there. That is one key thing. It had to be constructed in compliance at that time. Now it could be in the floodplain right now and it was built in compliance and your base flood elevation went up. Or it could be you built something else, you moved from a V zone to an A zone. That would be another grandfathering situation. So these are the ones where you didn't do anything and now it's moved basically, your BFE moved up or your zoned moved.
So we had a lot of these grandfathered structures. Back in 2009, we adopted new flood insurance rate maps. Many of the elevations had gone up. So we had many structures that were either built in compliance with a floodplain permit, which now the elevation had moved up and they were no longer in compliance, or we had homes that were built prior to being mapped floodplain. So I think both of those examples would fall under the grandfathering.
There are some caveats with that though, is that you have to have coverage now, okay? So you have to have coverage before the maps change and it has to be contiguous coverage. You have to keep it going. The rates will be gradually increased, but at least you don't get hit at one big time with the change. One thing I'll say is that if you have insurance policy, and if one of these will be better than the other one, and your insurance agent hopefully will tell you different scenarios and help you steer into the better rate system that is good for you. Myself and the county here, the insurance part of it is between you and your insurance company. So if you have, like I said, just make sure you know these key words, and hopefully they'll map out what's the best rates for you.
Grandfathering does not survive a change in ownership, does it?
If it's contiguous coverage, so if you have it and then the new owner has it, as long as the coverage is continuous. Yep. Elevation certificates. So a little different with some of the new insurance is that in order to rate policies now, you need an elevation certificate. And what the elevation certificate means, so if you have a policy already, they will continue your coverage without the elevation certificate. But again, you should be aware of this because you may be paying higher than if you actually get the elevation certificate. Or if you sell, the new owners are going to need an elevation certificate. That's what this tells the insurance company is where the floodplain is, or the 1% chance is, in relationship to where your first floor is. So I'm going to just do some round numbers here. So let's say the BFE is 800, and your first floor is 799. What that tells the insurance company is that your first floor is 1 foot below that 1% chance. They will base your rate on that. Let's say we're back to 800, and let's say your first floor is 2 foot above that 800. They will base your insurance rate on that 2 foot above.
So your rate should be better the higher
Yep.
your home is.
Are we taking Kristen?
You keep talking about insurance companies, and I guess I would like a little clarification. Do you shop for flood insurance with every insurance company out there, even though it's sponsored by the government?
That's a misconception too. What happens is the government, yes, it's sponsored by the government, but it's in private insurers that do the insurance. The government's just covering the policies and paying the insurance companies the difference. So
you would shop it just like your auto coverage?
Yep, you can go to whatever insurance company. You can have private insurance if you want too. It'll be higher rates. And that's why insurance has historically been with the government, is because they were subsidizing the difference. And they still do. So when the damages come out, when you see FEMA say there's, $50 billion worth of insurance, they're paying the insurance companies that. They're not paying you. It's all through your insurance company. So back to elevation. So the rates are based on that relationship. And as Sue kind of pointed out, the lower you are, the higher risk you are, and the more you're going to pay in flood insurance, versus the higher you are and the more elevated you are, the less you're going to pay in flood insurance. Also, it matters what you have covered. One other thing is mortgages, are required if you are in a high-risk area to have flood insurance. You're only required to cover your mortgage, not your actual house itself. Something to be aware of that happened a lot in 2008, and I felt so bad because people only covered their mortgage, but their house was destroyed. And all they got was the amount to cover their mortgage and nothing else. So be aware of that. So go ahead, Sue. here's the
So
plan.
it really sounds like you should be talking with your insurance agent to find out a lot of details.
Yep, and someone, I had a talk somewhere else in the state, and they're like, you sound like an insurance agent. And I said, I've just seen people lose their lives. And I just want to stress how important that is, because if you don't have the insurance, you have nothing. There's government, I know there's a perception that they're going to bail you out, but honestly, it's not a lot. So.
And the next two slides, we're just kind of taking this concept a little further, and this is an example that I came across this summer. And as Michelle had said, the regulations that we enforce, the building requirements that we enforce through the floodplain permits are based on both the federal requirements and the state requirements. So, of course, we don't deal with insurance, but I had someone that had a larger property on the waterfront. They were able to bring in more fill than what was required. Through our regulations, it is required, as Michelle had said previously, that the first floor of the home be elevated 2 feet higher than that base flood elevation, and that's to protect from that water getting into your home and damaging what's important. This property owner had put their house 3 feet higher, and the quote on insurance before they constructed was $3,000 a year, meeting those regulations that were required to enforce that home being 2 feet higher. And if you move forward, they then inquired as to what the rate would be if they put it up 1 foot higher than that. And as you can see, their rate went down to $675 per year. So it's not something that we're trained on our end, but I try to let people know that talk to their insurance agent, ask questions, see if there are options available, because as I said, they had a larger lot. They were able to bring in more fill to elevate it even higher to protect the home, and it helped them in the long run with their insurance rates. And that this, pardon?
Pass the sign-in sheet around.
Okay, it's right here. Sorry, I'll
Sorry.
pass that on. Mariah's gonna take over. We are gonna pass around a sign-in sheet. Sorry, we forgot to do this in the beginning.
So I'm going to back up a little bit and give you some more Door County specific information as far as when we've adopted what with regard to the floodplain program. So in 1965 was when the original Wisconsin floodplain legislation was adopted. It stated the same purposes that are in place now for floodplain legislation, which is to protect human life and health and to minimize property damage and economic loss. Municipalities were required to adopt an ordinance within 1 year after engineering data became available. So this is a Wisconsin law that was passed in 1965. Then in 1968 and 1973, there was federal level legislation, so the National Flood Insurance Act and the Flood Disaster Protection Act. In 1976, so we're already 11 years after Wisconsin's first law, was the first time that federal money became available to produce a zoning ordinance and a preliminary flood insurance study, so the maps for Door County. So in 1977 was when that final flood insurance study was issued. And then in 1978 was when those first flood insurance rate maps, so FIRM, when you hear people using the acronym FIRM, as Michelle explained, that's what that's for. So those were issued in April of 1978 it was then the Department of Housing and Urban Development, so it was HUD. That administers the floodplain program. And Door County did not enact a floodplain ordinance at that point, in part because of a perception that there was a lack of real flood events happening in the county. So in 1982, 4 or 5 years later, Door County did adopt a floodplain ordinance based on that 1977 study and those 1978 maps. And that was because of everything that Michelle just walked you through with mortgages and flood insurance. People that were in the floodplain were not able to obtain federally backed mortgages, which is 90+% of all mortgages, if the property was in the floodplain. So Door County, I know that Michelle said the program's voluntary, but it felt pretty much obligatory that we joined so that people buying and developing waterfront property would be able to have federally backed mortgages. In 1986 and in 1995, we updated Door County's floodplain ordinance. As Michelle has already explained, there are state level regulations and there are federal level regulations, and the state writes a model ordinance and we just adopt the ordinance that they give to us. We don't get to change anything. We pop Door County in where it asks for the name of the municipality, and that's about all the say that we get.
Can I just interject a little bit? The local community, as Mariah said, would have to adopt that model ordinance, but they can be more restrictive. So we do have some communities across the state that have higher standards than what's in the model ordinance. And I always like to use Waukesha County because they don't permit any floodplain development in their county. So you can, if you would like to be more restrictive, you can do that. But as Mariah said, you have to adopt at least that minimum model ordinance.
Thanks. Yeah, and all Door County has ever done is just adopt the model ordinance. We haven't adopted any additional or more restrictive changes.
Excuse me, for the way you phrase that, then more lenience not possible.
Correct. Yeah, this is a minimum standard that the state and the federal government say that we have to enact. In 2005, it was at the federal level when the responsibility for the flood program switched from the Housing and Urban Development Agency to the Federal Emergency Management Agency. So everyone always refers to it as FEMA, I think even, well, pretty much everybody. In 2006, FEMA contracted with a private consultant to update the flood insurance study and to modernize the maps for Door County, probably other areas as well, but I know for sure Door County. They incorporated studies that reflected the high water elevations that were on Lake Michigan in the 1980s, wind setup and wave run-up effects, and part of the reason that they did that study as well was our old paper maps were really, really terrible. Go ahead. So in January of 2009 is when we adopted the new, again, model ordinance text and those maps. There were basically three different things that happened. There were increased elevations along Green Bay and Lake Michigan, and we had a lot of properties coming into being mapped as floodplain that were not previously. We also had additional floodplain mapped adjacent to unstudied rivers and streams, and then there were some regulatory changes from what we had previously updated in, I think, 1995 is what I said, but not a lot. We did just in December of 2017 update our floodplain zoning ordinance text because we found out that after we adopted the 2009 model, we just found out in the last year or so that they made a new model shortly after that. So we've been operating on an outdated one. So we are working to get our ordinance updated and certified so it's consistent with what's in effect now. So I'm going to turn it back over to Sue to talk a little bit about some of the regulations that have been in place as Door County has had this program.
And feel free to jump in if I miss something. Just to kind of give you some basic information on the floodplains or floodplain areas that we have. Floodway is oftentimes associated with riverine systems. Floodways are the areas where no construction can take place. It's where the actual flow of water is taking place during the flood event. Two other zones that you'll hear repetitively here, the AE zone, and really that is the floodplain areas where development can take place where there is a known elevation. So we keep talking about the BFE, the base flood elevation. That is where FEMA has done a study saying that that area may have some flooding to that 1% chance in any given year.
Also, FEMA can do a study, or if someone feels that that study is not accurate, they can hire their own engineers and follow the mapping standards from FEMA to correct that if they feel that it's not correct.
Thank you. So at this point, examples are along the Bay and Lake Michigan where we have set known elevations. Also, and Miles may talk about this later, these are still water elevations where flooding will be at a specific elevation, not in relation to waves and run up and things that you'll hear about soon. Another zone that we do have in the area in Door County, as well as other locations, is the A zone. And this flood zone is basically unstudied. It's a very approximate, I always talk about a wide paintbrush that FEMA has placed in an area where they think flooding will occur or has the potential to occur. And so we have no elevations to go off of. These are the most challenging areas for both owners as well as staff on this end trying to work with owners. Studies need to be done in order to determine that elevation, and that is done by the property owner themselves to come up with that. We do kind of have a subset in Door County of this Zone A, the 3 inland lakes that we have in northern Door County. Under FEMA, the flood insurance rate maps, they are mapped as Zone A's. However, we do have some DNR studies that have been done and that FEMA has accepted us to use for regulatory purposes, but it still shows up as that A zone, which can affect insurance rates. And I don't know if you can give any input or have anything else to add, but when you have a known elevation, I'm sure the insurance companies are better able to assess their risk and what your policy should be. When you have an unstudied area and no known elevation, I'm guessing from an insurance perspective, that's a riskier loan perhaps to write.
And I did have a handout over there having those different zones and the elevations and what the average cost is for them. So if you wanted to look at them, you can.
Also, many of the smaller streams in Door County are unstudied as well. So you'll see those A zones along many of the streams. And I think I covered that last bullet point. Yep. We'll get into the 3 inland lakes a little bit more. So when we talk about flood fringe or floodplain in the A zone or the AE zone, these areas are still considered buildable. However, in order to build in those areas, the structures must be built into compliance. Part of the application process and the construction involves elevations taken by a surveyor or an engineer of the existing ground to get an idea of what we're talking about elevationally, as well as an engineer or architect designing plans that are flood-proofed, trying to keep the water out of that structure. So those are needed whenever you're building in the floodplain. As far as regulations go, the crawl space would need to be at or above that base flood elevation. The first floor, that living space, always needs to be 2 feet above that. And then when we're talking about homes, 15 feet of compacted fill is required to be placed around the home, 1 foot above that base flood elevation. So those are the basic requirements when building a home in the floodplain. Within the regulations, there's also requirements when it comes to non-conforming homes. We talked earlier about homes being built in compliance, maps changing, and all of a sudden the elevations do not meet today's standards. When we're dealing with non-conforming homes that don't meet those elevational standards, there is a limitation as far as additions and or modifications to those homes, and it's based on a 50% equalized assessed value of that home, unless that home is brought into compliance, and then there is no limitation on that. At this point, we're going to turn it back over to Michelle.
So why is FEMA updating the community flood maps? Well, there's been changes. There's been population growth, increased development, movements in the rivers and coastline, changing weather patterns, and updating rainfall. And I should also say this is not unique to Wisconsin or Door County. They're doing the entire Great Lakes. So they're starting out, actually Ohio has preliminary maps. I believe Ohio and Pennsylvania have preliminary maps. And it's basically coming this way. Superior is going to be next year with these draft maps, the same as you guys are getting right now. So it's the entire Great Lake Basin. Back to you. Okay.
So just to give you a little bit of history, we've been talking about the Great Lakes Coastal Study. FEMA approached us in early 2012 to let us know that they were going to restudy the entire Great Lakes. They had held some informational meetings for us in, I think it was the summer of 2012. So they've been trying to get the communities involved in the beginning stages of this study. Letting us know all the engineering that was going into these maps, as well as trying to get our individual input on things that we may be more familiar with on the ground to give them help in developing the maps as well. So right away in the beginning, we've been trying to keep the county, as far as the county board supervisors and our oversight committee, informed of what's going on, and we have also had the county involved with writing letters to FEMA as well, letting them know that we were very concerned. We have a lot of shoreline on the Great Lakes here, but yet we have not had much flooding. So we wanted to make sure that we were involved as staff all the way through the process, and that we were concerned because we do have a lot of development along the coastlines. So in September and October of 2012, FEMA gave us preliminary points in which they were going to study. You know, we probably have, what would you guess, 10 elevations at the most along the bay and Great Lakes? Less than that. So a handful of different elevation along the bay and Lake Michigan. And when they said they were doing a new study which would have 100+ study points, we were quite concerned, thinking of the ramifications both for the citizens and staff, and trying to make sure that everyone could understand the complexity of that. So they had us look at those study points, and we were supposed to recommend whether the stretches within these points were relatively the same as far as characteristics. So we provided input at that time for that. I think we asked for 50 study points to be removed. And just to give you kind of an example as to why we would be asking that, the Peninsula State Park, there were 4 separate study points designated in that area, which we felt was quite excessive since it was a state park with not much development at all. So just to give you kind of some perspective, during that, staff spent many hours at that stage back in 2012 reviewing maps, and it continues on. We had our county board, we brought this to their attention. They wrote a resolution expressing their concerns as well. And then later, was it in 2012, they also wrote a draft report where they tried to compile information that was already in existence from the county and other sources to show what they were starting with as far as data points. And then they were going to add more data from that wherever they felt they had holes. For example, we at the county had 2-foot contours since 2002. I think it was. So at that time, we were actually ahead of many other counties with regard to that data as well. Next slide. So fast forward to this summer, we hadn't heard much for some time.
Can I just interject?
You bet.
From all those concerns, FEMA went back to the drawing board.
Oh, see, these are things we don't.
That's what happened, is that they felt that they should look at their studies again. So that's why there was such a big gap between the two.
And going back to the drawing board, the analysis, they looked at wind directions, they looked at storm events, they looked at the number of points that were utilized, and they weren't, based on the information that was provided by the local communities, they weren't comfortable moving ahead either. So they went back and said, we need to take a look at this, and that's what happened.
Thanks for filling in those holes.
So in 2012, were any property owners informed of this?
This was the very beginning stages. FEMA was reaching out to the communities to find what data we had available to even think about doing a study. So, you know, as far as reaching out to the public, they weren't at that point, I
You
believe.
had meetings with FEMA though.
We were invited to go to a meeting in Green Bay where there were maybe 6 counties that were invited to learn about what they were starting to do.
And that's the one that FEMA in their letter suggested that homeowner association members were invited.
No, that's
I
this
don't-
year.
That, it sounds like that was this year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you involve outside consultants or engineers in your feedback?
No, we don't have the financial wherewithal to do that or the staff to do that.
And I'll get into that a little later too about, you know, the type of engineer and.
Okay, so moving forward, fast forward to this year, like we said, there was a large gap between 2012 when we first found out FEMA was doing this study to this summer. FEMA had sent us a letter saying we're going to have this draft work map session. So they sent us a letter and email giving us a website to look at the maps and that they would give an informational PowerPoint to us. So that took place this summer. I can tell you that as staff, we spent many hours looking at these maps on the computer to see how this new VE zone, which is a new, and we didn't get into the details, but it's a floodplain based on velocity of waves crashing into the shoreline or coming up over the shoreline. And we'll get into more details about that. But as staff, we spent many hours looking over these maps to see what we could find out. We were learning on the fly. And FEMA gave us a very short period of time to give feedback with regard to those maps. So we did provide FEMA some comments pointing out the main point that FEMA wanted us to look at these maps were they were not here on the ground, and they wanted us to be able to somehow explain or see on the ground if where these different V zones came in at different elevations, if it made sense in relationship to the topography that we saw. For example, there are studies in different areas where we may have a couple feet difference in elevation with these new flood zones, and they wanted to know if they had placed those transitioning points going from one elevation to another, if it made sense on the ground. So that's what we spent our time looking at as they directed us to. So many of our comments back to FEMA were suggesting to move that transitional line between the elevations either further north or further south, depending on what we had seen. If it goes from a bluffy area to a sand dune area, we could see somewhat of a distinction between the topography on the shoreline. We also provided comments to FEMA. There was one stretch in Sturgeon Bay north of the canal that was more substantially covered, much of the area. In fact, new homes that were built 75 feet from the ordinary high were covered, and that concerned me. So that was one of the main concerns pointed out to FEMA as well, for them to take a look at and reconsider and or look at their data. So after that point in September, we submitted all that information. FEMA said they would get back to us with regard to those comments, which they did December 21st. We had many points for them to consider, some of which they agreed that some of those transitional areas should be moved to an area where the topography made more sense. Some, the changes or differences in wave elevation for their studies were more so based on wind or bathymetry, which is the contours of the lake below water. And so some of them were not moved at all. The Sturgeon Bay stretch that I pointed out earlier, FEMA took a look at that, or their contractor, and they said that they had made a mistake and translating from the engineering results onto the map. And I believe they said, and don't quote me, but I believe the change was a 124-foot mistake. So instead of homes being covered up by this new V zone, it was actually waterward of those homes. So FEMA makes mistakes too. So the stretch I'm referring to in Sturgeon Bay is north of the canal to Kickapoo. It encompasses Portage Park, which is owned by the town, and it's on the Lake Michigan side. So FEMA had gotten back to us. We can provide additional comments. With the holidays and being early January, we haven't gone through all of their comments in great detail as of yet. One thing to point out, obviously we've been talking about the Great Lakes, Green Bay, Lake Michigan, but somewhere along the line we have riverine systems that dump into the bay and into Lake Michigan. And that's one thing that FEMA has not done yet, is figured out how those two things will join up. So there is still quite a bit of work on FEMA's end to do with regard to mapping before these things go live.
Yeah, I think we should point that out really early, is that these are draft. They're not even preliminary, so they're very, very early in the stage. So when we have a set of maps back there, like I said, the actual product does not look like that. It's just to help for the discussion to start. And there's a lot more time in the aspect that there are other opportunities to comment on these maps, that it's not just, it's done.
And that's part of what we're doing here today. You had asked a comment about bringing the public in. When has the public been brought into the conversation? So we are trying to be forthright and give you the information ahead of time. Like we said, the preliminary flood insurance rate maps, which haven't even been done yet because they're not combined with streams, and they're not finished dotting their I's and crossing their T's, those maps are not going to be available to us to review for another 1.5 to 2 years. But we do want the citizens to be aware of what's going on and let them know, both for insurance purposes, for construction purposes. So that's why we invited you here today, so we could let you know where we are and what is going on. If we go to the next slide. So one thing we wanted to point out, we've been talking the last couple of minutes about the VE zone or the V zone with the wave action, not just that still water floodplain elevation. Up until now, that's all we have regulated. In 2009, we pointed out earlier that map, that flood insurance rate map, brought up elevations in many areas higher than what we used to be regulating at. What I wanted to bring out with regard to these draft work maps is that many of our floodplain areas, those with elevations, we've seen a reduction in along the bay, along Lake Michigan. We have seen areas that were quite heavily mapped that are no longer mapped floodplain at all. We have seen some elevations go down. So I don't want to paint gloom and doom. I was actually pleasantly surprised that the still water elevations have gone down and have been reduced in many of the areas.
But not all, right?
But not all. I mean, we still will have floodplain. We still will have homes being built in the floodplain. Another thing that I just wanted to point out, we've been talking with FEMA, we've been talking with the Department of Natural Resources. Our 3 inland lakes north, Europe, Kangaroo, and Clark Lake, the flood insurance rate panels touch those 3 lakes. So early on in this process, we had asked FEMA, is there any way that we could incorporate studies of those 3 inland lakes, since they're unstudied lakes, with the A zone, if we could somehow incorporate that into these new maps when we go live in the future. And FEMA has provided money or allowed the state to do some engineering work on our behalf, and this is wonderful news. So those 3 lakes will have had studies done and hopefully be put on these new firm flood insurance rate maps in about 2 years. So I think that is, not everyone can say that FEMA gave them money to do studies and improve their maps. So I think that is a benefit to our citizens here in Door County as well. But as we said, the biggest change to Door County is going to be these VE zones or the V zones. Maybe we're not even saying it correctly. Is it V or VE?
It's the same thing as Zone A, so VE means it's studied.
Okay, so VE zones with known elevations.
Yep.
And that is because of that wave run-up. Let's see here. Obviously, it's new to Door County, it's new to Wisconsin, it's going to be new to the Great Lakes.
We're all learning about them.
Sue and Mariah, I'd like to personally, I know we want to hold, but we're on this topic. Thank you for trying to provide me and other people in Lake Forest Park with as much accurate information as you're able to glean from this as we're all learning. I know you've questioned a number of things, and I know I've probably re-asked questions, but where does this, and I asked you last week and maybe you found out since, where does this 124 versus 259 feet originate? Where's the starting point? And
So you're getting into a very specific question as it relates to the Sturgeon Bay stretch. We can go into that in more detail later, but
Okay.
I do not know where they start the distance of what they covered. So in general terms, what I can tell you today is that the homes in that stretch are no longer covered, that they moved the line closer to Lake Michigan, 124 feet. But
Real reference, yeah.
They did not give us a reference point, but that's something we can talk about in more
Thanks.
detail, as that's a very specific
And also, I know
question.
you questioned a number of things in your input to them, but it was admitted that this Transect 7 has 11.5-foot waves, yet the transects on either side have 4.5-foot waves. Should that not be questioned? I don't see a lot of difference as I travel around either in the summer or in the winter of wave occurrence, you know, on a subjective fashion. I just wonder how 11.5-foot waves are possibly measured.
I understand your concern. I'm not an engineer. And again, that is a very specific question, and whether FEMA will look into that anymore, we will find out. We need to review their comments from December 21st, but
Concern?
We already did.
we already did.
Oh, good,
Yeah,
thank
we
you.
already
We
did
did in
long
September.
ago. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, and moving on, so in preparing for today's meeting, not only the Sturgeon Bay stretch that is getting attention, but as staff, we re-looked at all of these work maps again, trying to find if there were any other homeowners within the unincorporated towns. And I just want to point that out because we forgot to mention that earlier. Door County regulates floodplain in the unincorporated areas. So we did not review maps for the cities or the villages, but within those towns, is that the 120 after Sturgeon Bay? There's still approximately 120 homes that are either covered by this VE zone, or touching the VE zone. And that's why we sent out specific mailings to those homeowners to let them know, to let them look for this meeting so that we could get them information as soon as possible.
So we did not get a letter that implies that you're not in the VE zone?
I can't guarantee that. We did our best to try to find all of those areas that are covered, but with trees, with shadows on air photos, we're human, we could only do as much as we can, but we tried to incorporate as many that we could see as possible, and we spent hours looking at these maps to try to get the word out. We have information at the GreatLakesCoastal.org. We'll go into more websites at the end of our presentation. And Miles will be talking more about the study and the Great Lakes coastal area as well. But this VE zone is for areas where they have come up with waves higher than 3 feet. So areas where the engineering came up and said that the waves are going to only be 2 feet, they will not be mapped this blue VE zone. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Michelle to talk about the VE zone in a little bit more detail.
So just to give you a little background in the VE zone, it's a velocity zone, which means it's wave action. These pictures are from Jefferson County, my county, in 2008, where, if you're familiar with the area, there was Lake Koshkanan. It's a very big lake. At the height of the flooding event, at the peak of the flooding event, a storm came out of the south and brought the waves into, we call it the North Shore of the lake. And this is the result of it. The waves crashed in. So I had really good velocity zone flood waves pictures to show you guys because of that. There, again, it's the same thing as we were talking about earlier with the Zone A's. Flood insurance is mandatory in these zones. There are base flood elevations derived by these zones. They're just taking into consideration those 3-foot waves. So it's not a still water elevation, it's more of a wave action elevation. So I hear a lot, well, the water never gets to that 11 feet. It's not that the water is going to get to that 11 feet, it's that the waves may get to that 11 feet. And I'm just using your example. I have no knowledge about that, but I just wanted you kind of to depict that. And in these cases, that's what happened. The water was here, but with the waves actually came up higher and knocked these off the foundation. Those were knocked off the foundation. These zones are new to the Great Lakes, as I said. We're all learning at this. The state is learning. Every state along the coast, we call it the coast now. You're on a coast. And so the V zones were always related to the oceans and Florida, North Carolina. So they're basically derived from that kind of system. And so it's new. And the one thing that's new is that federal standards, which will be, again, the model will have the federal standards and it will have the state standards. We do have coastal regulations in our state standards. They're just very minimal. I mean, it's not a lot. And so most of the standards that will be coming in this new V zone will be federal standards. Basically, the biggest difference for you, is that right now, when we talk about the lowest floor, we're talking about what you step on. That's the lowest floor in an A zone. In a V zone, what the lowest floor is the subgrade, the subsystem of that floor. So my depiction here, is it right here? So this is an A zone, and that's the lowest floor, and that's where the 2-foot freeboard should be. Now it's going to be below that floor. So that's one of the biggest changes. The other big change is that we can't use fill, and we have to have the below the home free of obstruction, which means the pillars, pilings, piers. This is actually from the Mississippi up along a floodway, which does allow for these type of systems. We see many homes along the Mississippi with the piers, the pilings. And they shouldn't have anything obstruction here. A lot of people store things down there, park their houses. If you see the Florida pictures, they park their cars, do some storage. So that is another big change than what we usually see. There's some key other components is that we can't use fill for the structural support. It's prohibited federally. It has to be on those pier and pilings, and it's supposed to withstand the water pressure and the wind loads for that base flood event. So because of that, it has to be designed by an engineer. And as you can probably guess, I'm sure there's a lot of engineers in Wisconsin that know how to design these, right? That's going to be an issue, I think, is because we don't have a lot of these buildings. Now, Miles is going to talk about engineering. I'm sure there's going to be a way that translates to loads, but this is going to be new. Like I said, we do have a lot in the Mississippi. So, and then part of that is a certificate from the engineer that's going to design these and sign off. So I'll turn it over to Miles, and he's going to talk to you about the engineering. And are you going to get close to Sue,
I'll
or do
stay
you want me
close.
to stay close to you?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, I'll stay there. I'm mic'd, so I'm going to be Miles's buddy a little bit because he doesn't have a mic.
Next steps, Door County, I think we can still, that's one of the reasons we're having this, is to get additional information so we can get with FEMA. The second thing, 12 to 18 months from now, it could be later, anticipates finishing the preliminary maps. This is kind of a unique situation. I want to explain a little bit, is that FEMA's really never did this for floodplain mapping before, where they've asked for input, where they went back and restudied information. So, to take advantage of this situation is really a good thing. And it's not taking advantage of a situation, it's actually, that's what they want us to do, is they want us to go back and they want us to get them the best information possible, because they don't want to be mapping garbage either. So, so they anticipate, with bringing the riverine system in to the analysis, they anticipate probably, 12 to 18 months. It could be 24 with the flooding we've had down south and their staff. But finishing the preliminary map. So what does that mean? And you had heard talk about a public meeting. Well, one of the formal things about the public meeting is what they call the open house. Once the open house is set, the maps are set. So this input now is really important to get it there. Once the open house is met, and I'll go through the engineering on that a little bit, there's a 30-day what's called an appeal and protest period. That's where you as a property owner say, I don't agree with this. FEMA says, okay, we got an appeal and a protest period here. Provide us that information so that we can correct the maps if you feel they're wrong. Well, how do you do that? It's going back to getting an engineer, having them do that analysis. Everything that FEMA had done, your engineer would redo and then resubmit, and they may change the map. So it's a process, but it's formal. Formal adoption deadline will be set after that appeals and protest period, and that's 6 months. So the county, has the opportunity to adopt the mapping and the ordinance, because with the new terminology, there'll be new criteria with the wave run-up. Yeah. So you can go to the next one.
I was asking, how will property owners be notified of the meeting and when the maps are done?
Well, Miles,
Go
can
ahead.
I? FEMA's only required to do, this is the FEMA minimum, is to publish it in the paper. If the community would like to do additional noticing, that is up with the community. I will say from DNR and FEMA, they will do the minimum, and I can't speak for the county on that one too.
And I believe the last time, Mariah, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe in 2009, we at Door County did a press release along with that. And I don't know if you want to speak to that or not, Mariah?
We would likely, we did do a press release in 2009, and then I think we also, we keep as best we can a running spreadsheet of all of the 19 clerks and either board chairs, plan commission chairs, and I routinely email them information and rely on them to distribute to their different agencies and all that kind of thing. But we already have, as Sue has talked about, a list of the 120 or so property owners that we think are affected by this new V zone. So it'd be relatively easy for us to regenerate that list and notify those property owners if they look like they're still mapped at that point, I guess. But
Would a township who has trouble with an area that's being put into the floodplain map has a concern, deal through the county then to get some information to how that best be handled?
Right now, FEMA seems to want to hear only from us, so we're trying to act as the funnel to get everything to them. I think Miles on the next slide is going to talk about if a town or a group of property owners or a single property owner would like to go out and hire an engineer to look at some of this stuff. He's going to talk about what he suggests in terms of what you would look for in an engineer. So maybe we can let him talk about that and see if that answers some of the questions.
Just so, and like I talked about earlier, the firm maps, it's the community and FEMA, so that's who has all the communication goes through is through the community. So, and if you have information to bring to the community takes it to FEMA.
When you say community, you're talking about
The
county.
county,
Yep.
and then the city and the villages, yeah.
Yeah.
That was my question.
Yeah, on the previous slide that Miles talked through, we had talked to a number of property owners along that stretch in Sturgeon Bay that was originally shown as being in the VE zone about requesting all of the data from FEMA in order to make it available to property owners. That stretch of Sturgeon Bay now is no longer going to be mapped as being in that VE zone, but as Sue said, there's still 120 or so roughly in the towns. We don't know about the villages in the city, but 120 or so property owners that are shown as being in that VE zone. We can request data if some of those property owners or the towns would like to have it. In talking to FEMA, they would like us, the county, to just make one request because they said we're talking about external hard drives. They're talking about terabytes worth of information. So to have, town X and Y and Z all requesting different pieces of it is going to be, it's going to be a challenge for them to figure out how to get it to us and for us to figure out how to get it to whoever wants it. But we are willing to request that. FEMA, I put summer 2018 in question marks on that because FEMA, they're still going back and forth with us. So we submitted those comments in September of this past year. Like Sue said, they've now given us comments back. We've got about a month and a half, maybe a month from now to get our comments on our comments back. So they don't consider their work done either. So requesting those terabytes worth of information right now doesn't make any sense. So I put summer 2018 as a guess as to when the commenting back and forth will be done for them to think that they're, more or less done with what they've dealt with so far. Like Sue said, they still need to figure out the riverine systems and the inland lakes and all of that, but.
So what Mariah is saying is FEMA has suggested that the data is not complete or at a final stage. So we don't want to request data at this point when it may change, and then you need to redo all the engineering yet again. So that's the take home on that comment.
Is the remaining 120 Sturgeon Bay only, or is it countywide?
Countywide.
That's countywide.
Countywide.
And the properties on Lake Forest Park Drive, are they not part of the 120, or they outside? Are they part
The
of
stretch, Sue can give a more specific, and actually we can maybe when we pull up the web map, we can pull up the stretch in Sturgeon Bay.
Correct. We've been told that the homes in that stretch are no longer going to be mapped as VE. So previously we had about 140 properties. So yeah, the Sturgeon Bay section has been removed from that number.
Let's let Miles talk through the engineering considerations so that you can get a better idea when or if we get the data for you, what you might want to do with it.
Yeah, before I get into that, I had, there's some handout sheets over there, and I kind of want to reiterate what was said previously about, this isn't unique for Door County, this isn't unique for Wisconsin. Well, it is unique for Door County, Wisconsin, but it's an entire Great Lakes system that they're mapping. So, and it's progressing from the east to the west, and that's important to know, because when you start looking at engineers who are working on this type of analysis, the research may go back to, you might want to go to those individuals that have done this before. So, talking to Ohio engineers and who does coastal work out in Ohio, it's important to kind of understand that this isn't just kind of Wisconsin, and Wisconsin has great engineers, everyone's wonderful. But when it comes time for their resume and what they do, it's extremely important. From an engineering standpoint too, a little bit about the V zones. There's actually two types of analysis that's used here. There's what's called wave run-up, and if you think of a revetment, where the water will hit that revetment and come up, okay? Or if you look at a beach area, where you have your waves progress into shoreline. So when these points were picked, they tried to look at that topography, and then they tried to team with the county and say, okay, let's look at these points and let's see what happens here. So it was looked at that way. So when you look at VE zones, which is velocity zones, and the waves do different things with different topography. And later on, I'm going to talk about letter and map revisions, letter and map amendments, but letter and map revisions are no different than what you do right now. It's, let's just say you want to revise the map. Let's just say you have a beach area and the wave comes in, and let's just say, and I'm moving way ahead here, let's say you want to build a revetment, or you want to take a revetment out. That's going to affect the wave situation or that velocity zone. So for an example, when you do a river analysis, okay, and you want to develop alongside a riverine system, you do what's called an encroachment analysis, right? You see what elevation you can, how much fill you can put in and what elevation you have, so you do that type of analysis. A coastal analysis is similar to that. You can go through a letter map revision, but you're going to put a revetment in or take a revetment out, and that's going to change things. So what are you, going back to select,
I'm back.
yeah. Selection of an engineer, all right. I come from the consulting side of the world, so I know a little bit about it. You search for an engineer that's familiar with FEMA and the Great Lake Coastal process. So there's not a lot of engineers that have a lot of knowledge on this type of analysis. I don't. Personally, I don't at all. Riverine system, yeah, I can design riverine system, you know, the HEC-RAS analysis, but coastal is another animal. So let's just say you're looking for an engineer. What you want to do is, to do that, the first thing you want to do is you develop a scope of services. What do you want that consultant to do? So you develop your scope of services, and based on that scope of services, you obtain a quote and from a consultant. But what you also want to get is you want references. You want what projects did they work on before? Are they familiar with it? Did they do some coastal analysis in Ohio? Then you call up the individuals they did work for, and you say, okay, gentlemen, how did they do? Did they fulfill their needs? So you got references, similar project information, and you know, the selection of an engineering consultant is your responsibility. So if I was to say, you know, they're all good. It's going to be up to you. It's going to be up to the situation. Where's your development? You know, is there a revetment there? Are they familiar with revetments and, you know, wave run-up? But here's where the caveat comes in, and the concern that I have is, let's just say during this 30-day appeal period after the open house, for you to have that engineer on board and ready to go and provide those results to FEMA within 30 days is very tight. So we wanted to put something here for you to consider, to talk about, and do some research. And that's about all I can say on that. Letter and map amendments. The terminologies for this coastal analysis are exactly the same as a riverine or kind of Lake Michigan. You get letter and map amendments. Are you in or are you out? You talk about elevation certificates. They're important, but that's, in a coastal analysis, that is not the only thing you look at. As Michelle had shown, you could see where they want things on stilts. not on fill anymore, because there's a, based on material types of the soils, and they look at, as this wave action goes, it's gonna be pulling material away. So you can still apply for letter of map amendments, but it's gonna be a little different. So when you have your, a lot of times you'll have a surveyor do a letter of map, you know, your elevation certificate. They're gonna have to know as well, you know, what is FEMA looking for on a letter of map amendment for this coastal analysis area in the velocity zone. Letter of map revisions, that's, and one of the things on letter of map amendments, as a department, we don't get involved in them at all. It's between the surveyor, they'll apply for a letter of map amendment for FEMA for you, and then either you get one or you don't get one. When it comes to a letter of map revision, what we as a department do, we provide a concurrence review. Let's just say you have a coastal analysis and it changes that floodplain boundary, then they submit it to the department for a concurrence. That's during the normal map. But here with this coastal at this particular time, that letter of map revision is gonna be done through the consultant you hired working right with FEMA. So that's kind of how they'll revise those maps. All right. And the only other thing I have, there's this called storm surge and wave modeling handout, and it talks about those two wave run-up areas, and there's a more detailed analysis description about the E-zones, so.
We're gonna have Sue walk people through those so
Oh,
you can tell.
okay.
Show people what they are. The reason that I had asked Miles to briefly talk about letters of map amendment and letters of map revision are just so that you know that there's at least two processes out there already for when a map is completely adopted, where there's the possibility at least of you being mapped, taken out of the floodplain, or if you meet certain requirements. So even if you get mapped as floodplain, it's possible, again, with hiring your own either surveyor or engineer, that you may be able to get yourself removed from the floodplain. So now we're going to talk about resources, and then we can take some more questions after that. So we have a variety of local resources that are available. The County Land Use Services Department, so that's me and Sue and Rick and Jeff and our other co-workers, are upstairs on the 3rd floor of this building. We have both if you wanted to look at them for some reason, the 1982 and the 2009, the existing 2009 hard copy floodplain maps. We also have the hard copy of the draft work maps that FEMA gave us in August of 2017. Those are back here on this table, which you can take a look at the end of the meeting. On our website, which Sue's gonna walk you through in a little bit, we have the existing floodplain zoning ordinance text. We have the August 2017 presentation that FEMA did for us here in Sturgeon Bay. We have this presentation, so all of these slides are now up there. We have a list of local surveyors, and then if you're actually applying to do something, we have our floodplain zoning application forms. So there's a lot of stuff either within our department physically or on our website or in both places. We also have what's called the Door County Web Map, which is shows pretty much every data layer that the county has related to land. You can look at zoning, you can look at floodplain zoning, you can look at topography, soil types, et cetera. 2017 aerial photos, we just had an aerial flyover in April, I think, of 2017, so those air photos are on there. Parcel boundaries, so probably as much information as you might want, at least initially. So I'm going to have Sue walk you through some of those now. Do you want me to do the computer part?
I think I can do it. Yeah.
Okay.
So some of the things we wanted to show you, first of all, the planning department website. On the website, if you scroll down under Door County ordinances here, you'll see that we have the floodplain zoning, which is our floodplain zoning ordinance currently. As Mariah had mentioned, 2017 update. So this is the FEMA presentation from the summer. We have our presentation that we're doing today as well. The web map we wanted to show you as well. Everyone has access to this. On the left-hand side, we have a tab with layers. You can get many different air photo years, should you wish. We also have elevations if you want to bring on 2-foot contours of a specific area. We have parcel data. Just by clicking these folders, you'll open up the subfolders. Right now, our floodplain that we adopted in 2009, our current floodplain maps are on the map currently. So if you were to zoom into an area, anything shaded in red will show up as mapped floodplain. So just wanted to show you that. As far as local surveyors, on our homepage here on the left-hand side, if you scroll down, you'll see that we have a list of registered land surveyors in the area as well. And this is another homepage we wanted to show you, and we have this at the end of our presentation. Under resources, do you want me to get into that at this point? Okay. Sorry. Took a tangent I wasn't supposed to.
No, sorry, just go back and do that. So this, whoops.
From current
Current slide, there we go.
So this is one of the actual slides in the PowerPoint presentation. So if you or anybody else after this meeting want to access these slides, that's where it is. And then that is our county department website. And as Sue just showed you on the live website, if you scroll down that page, you can get at all the floodplain related information. And then, that's okay. So just go to the next one.
Okay.
Keep going. And then this is the web map where she just showed you the different data layers where you can turn the floodplain layer on, you can turn the contour layers on, you can zoom into a property or a town. That's the website address for that. And then, yep, so like she just showed you, you can add those 2-foot contours and the floodplain on there. And then I'm gonna let Michelle talk for a minute about some of these. Actually, I think, or do you wanna do that or you want Miles?
I can do it quick. For the flood mapping, the Great Lakes Coast, or the org, is basically what Sue just showed you. They have what's going on in the Great Lakes on every level. So you not only you get Wisconsin, you will get Ohio. We just saw up there. So that's kind of their main page that FEMA's been using to get out information. The next one is basically where these preliminary maps are online. Draft maps, I shouldn't say preliminary, draft maps are online. You can go and interactively look at them. You don't have to look at the hard copies at your home. Also, the Map Service Center, the FEMA Map Service Center has current maps. They also have historic maps too, online, so you don't, I'm sure Mariah loved to see you come to her office, but you don't have to go if you don't want to. They are all online if you want to. If you have questions, FEMA does have a the 1-800 number if you have questions about the maps. If you have questions about what's a LOMA, what do I need for a LOMA, if you have a question about LOMARs. And they say if you have questions about regulations, but honestly, I'm going to direct you to Sue for that. But if you have questions about the mapping, any of that, you can do that 1-800 number. Also, if you have questions about insurance, as I said, go to your insurance agent, but there is a help center that FEMA does have, and basically they'll just tell you the general information. But again, your insurance agent is the main contact for that, but there is a contact for that.
Miles, these are the ones I thought that you could walk through, because you can pull up the actual link, because these are your handouts.
Okay.
So, just switching gear, I had gotten ahead of myself a little bit before,
Sorry,
but
that's okay.
the handouts that
close.
Miles has on the table, you can also access them online. And we were just going to show you where those links are found. So we have the analysis and mapping. So this.
Yeah, they have a lot of good information. Yeah, you can just click on the Great Lakes, click on that one once. there it talks about the coastal analysis and mapping. That one, I didn't bring that one along in particular, but it's a general one, and it shows, you know, the entire, all the lakes that are being studied, and it talks about stage and
The
various
ways.
things, kind of a nice overview.
So many of the handouts that Miles has brought, if you click on the tabs along the left-hand side of this, you'll see them coming up. We just wanted to give you some perspective of where to find these on that website.
GreatLakesCoast.org, you know, that's one to remember. And the one handout I did have had that website address right in there, right on top, so.
The other thing I wanted to point out on this website, if you scroll down, and many of you wanted to look at maps live, and you're able to zoom in and actually see structures through those air photos. It gets better as you zoom in, unlike the paper documents that you'll find in the back, which don't show a lot of detail. If you scroll down and you continue to scroll down, eventually you'll find Wisconsin. And there will be a link for Door County. If you click on that link, and I'm just going to walk you through so that you can understand how the website works. May take a second. Of course, you'll need to agree to their terms and conditions. Things that'll be helpful on the left-hand side, you'll see the base map gallery. If you click on that, and then on the right-hand side, either imagery or the hybrid, that'll bring on the air photo information. If there's a specific area you want to look at, let's say we're talking about Sturgeon or Nassauapi area, click on that box that contains the map, and on the bottom of that little panel that pops up, if you click zoom to, it'll bring you into that area. And we're just gonna, I don't know if this is gonna be a good example or not. As you zoom in, the picture quality changes and you start to see more or better air photos where you can actually see the structures themselves. So we've been talking about this V zone or VE zone. In these maps, it's the shaded blue area, and it's our understanding that that area is regulated based on what you see being covered up. So if a structure is covered up in that blue, that means that structure is going to
Or
have,
touching.
or
touching.
touching, will have those V zone regulations applied. Did you want me to show anything else, Mariah?
Not unless Miles wants to talk through any of the other handouts. Otherwise, I'd go back to the PowerPoint. And then we can
Okay, so we'll go back to the PowerPoint, and at this point in time,
I don't know,
I think we're at the questions point of our presentation.
Okay, so we're all gonna huddle together because we only have 2 mics between the 4 of us, and we'll just figure out who should answer which question. Yes?
I think my question is for Miles. In the course of your presentation, you have used terminology with regards to structures that are on the beach that FEMA would take into account in determining in their study to determine wave height levels. What was that term used?
Wave run-up.
Wave run-up.
The structure itself would be a revetment,
Yes.
or like a breaker wall, somewhere where the wave would actually hit and come up, is more like wave run-up.
Would riprap be considered a revetment?
Yeah.
And
Definitely.
does that tend to help in terms of reducing or mitigating the wave run-up?
Yeah, it creates the wave run-up is what it does, but the overland transfer of the wave, it stops that. So that component is a lot different. Sometimes, and we didn't talk about this, but there's what's called an AO zone as well. And that's the area of shallow flooding behind. So you can have a revetment where the water comes up and over, and behind that revetment have a shallow flooded area. So, yeah.
Miles, in the process you discussed about hiring an engineering firm, et cetera, and then the submission of that report to either correct or discuss with FEMA aspects, FEMA would ultimately have the right to not accept that report. Would that not be correct?
That's correct. So it's like having your engineer do that analysis.
Right.
And then, okay, this is your analysis, we're gonna submit it in. FEMA's engineer is then gonna look at it
Yeah.
and say, yeah, that makes sense. You know, that point maybe should have been over here and now they're gonna change things. If it makes sense to FEMA, they'll change it, definitely. Yeah. But in the same token, you're exactly right. If FEMA engineers feels, nah, I really think that's still there, it should be there, they'll reject it.
Hey, just first of all, nice job putting this together. I really appreciate you guys doing it. I appreciate doing the job. Everybody did a nice job of kind of keeping it civil and stuff like that, keeping it informative. But again, what a great thing for this flood thing that, you know, if I live someplace that's likely to flood, if I'm in Houston, if I'm in Miami or something like that, it's nice to be able to get the flood insurance and protect your properties. I guess speaking for a few, so in Lake Forest Park, it's just weird. I mean, that, you know, hey, here's all of a sudden, you know, my house has been there for over 100 years, 120 years, you know, and then all of a sudden now it's in a flood zone or potentially very close to flood zone, and it's just strange. I think speaking on behalf of the Lake Forest Park, it's just weird. There's no danger. There's never been a danger. And let's face it, if your house was not in a flood zone, all of a sudden you end up in a flood zone, then that the implications for, you know, for the insurance, the implications for, hey, I didn't build a house on my own property, now I got to put it up on stilts. It gets really, really weird. So again, it was a little frightening for us. I also understand now that 120 people have been notified by you guys, and basically, so none of us got letters, so I guess we're in the clear at least for right now.
Well, what we did was, as Sue explained it, I had the zoning admin, when Sue found the mile-long stretch in the town of Sturgeon Bay, where all the houses in that whole stretch were in that VE zone, and she said, this looks really weird, I don't know what's going on. So we talked about it with our oversight committee from the county board, and then she went to the town of Sturgeon Bay to let them know. And we all wanted to have a meeting for the property owners, but then I asked Sue and Rick and Jeff to go back through the entire county. And again, we're just talking the towns, so the villages in the city we did not look at, and identify anybody that was either in or touching, as best we could tell from the air photos, that VE zone. So that came out to 140 people, but it included that entire mile-long stretch of Sturgeon Bay town at that point, because we just found out probably maybe a week after we went ahead and publicized the meeting and everything else and sent out the mailing, that FEMA said, oh yeah, you're right, we looked at that, that wasn't correct. So, but there's still 120-ish or so property owners that we think may be affected by this new zone. Yes.
An aside, I noticed in hiking up and down the district we're discussing, at least 8 or 9 lots where I've seen resurvey done, and they're all contiguous. Is the county possibly doing that for elevation purposes? I've interviewed property owners and nobody seems to know why these new flags are being placed.
We're not, no, I mean, we don't have a surveyor on staff. The county does contract annually the last handful of years with a local surveying firm, but not to do shoreline-related stuff. It's completely different. It has to do with our parcel mapping data layer.
Okay, quick, where's the sign-up sheet? It never got to us.
Oh, your sign.
There should be a clipboard floating around, so yeah, please do make sure that you sign that up.
Thanks, we're good.
Before you,
Be good
okay.
coming in.
If somebody builds before all this happens, is that, let's say they're in a BE zone, or I should say preliminary BE zone, are they going to be required to build on stilts or breakaway basement or whatever the verbiage might be, or will they be ahead of the curve, for lack of a better
That'll be the
word?
grandfather.
Yeah, so right now, the maps aren't in effect. So if you came, and I'll just speak, if you came to the office today and you met the current floodplain requirements, they would issue you a permit, but then once the maps change, you will be in the VE zone and you will be a non-conforming structure. But just realize that you're going to be, your insurance-wise, you're going to be, it's going to be higher because now you're going to be in a lower elevation than what is going to come. And that when you plan to do any improvements in the future, it may affect you.
So does that, say you have to put the house on stilts, now does that change the county zoning in terms of height? because you have a different.
That's a question for them.
Actually, we're not allowed to because the state shoreland regulations, which are completely separate from the floodplain regulations, have a height restriction of 35 feet. Maybe Rick knows something I don't.
Just to continue with that, I mean, we have a base flood elevation and there's a flood protection elevation. The first floor has to be 2 feet above. How significant of a difference are we talking? I know nobody knows yet, but are we?
I mean,
is it-
you'd have to look at the specific location and
Each of-
see what the proposed height is.
Because, and I think
So.
of non-conforming structures in this area, how is anybody gonna ever add on to a non-conforming structure if the addition would have to be on stilts and a
Correct.
house that's sitting on the ground? I know there's a lot of things that you can't answer, but.
Well, my comment was that, yes, you could. Is it good for you to do? That's gonna be a decision of the landowner because of those non-conforming situation that you just described.
The future ramifications.
Yes. All we can do is tell the owner what's gonna happen, and then they're gonna have to decide how they're gonna build and then live in those ramifications later. For example, we had a situation in my county where the elevations went up after the 2008 flood by a foot. People were coming in to raise new structures, but I could not regulate that extra foot. I only could tell you that it was coming, and it was the homeowners decide to raise it up to that foot.
My concern is for the public is they're not gonna know the implications of these until these final maps come out. And they're gonna have 30 days to appeal this. And to me, that seems like a very small window for them to, they're really gonna have to anticipate appealing it before the 30 days starts and have an engineer lined up and.
Which is why I had you guys go through the maps and do
I
this.
think
So
where
that's
FEMA's coming from with the 30-day appeal period, they feel that they have everything in order when that open house is. They feel they're relatively confident, So the 30 days, you could appeal road names and things like that, but, sometimes though, they make mistakes, they're human too, so there is that 30-day period in there to
Do
do
we
that.
have access to their graphs prior to the 30-day period?
I don't think we get any maps between now and the release of those preliminary maps, unless they're gonna do something that revises that stretch of Sturgeon Bay where they've now said that, yeah, you're right, that was incorrect, but I don't.
And they will submit them to the community, the county before, but it could vary on the time frame. It could be 2 weeks, it could be 2 months. It varies depending on the project.
I'm trying to remember when we did this in 2009, because we adopted the new ordinance and the new maps that are in place right now in January of 2009. I want to say our open house meeting was in the
I
summer.
was gonna say the summer.
But I think, I don't know how far ahead of time we had the maps. I don't think it was very long
Yep.
before that
I don't
open
think
house
it is.
meeting. I think FEMA basically said, we want to do an open house meeting at Door County, and we held it in this room on the date that they told us they wanted it.
I just want to back up to your question and your concern because one thing we didn't cover, obviously, we can only speak in general terms right now, and I know we've been talking about Sturgeon Bay area. Of the 120 homes, obviously, I didn't look at every single stretch. There's 3 zoning administrators that each took time in their areas. What I saw in my area is the homes that we've included on the list in my area are oftentimes old houses constructed very close to the ordinary high, non-conforming structures that way, and much of the properties are still available for construction outside of this V zone. Now, it doesn't help them in their current structure that they're living, but I just wanted to point that out because many of the homes in my area, that was the situation. Sturgeon Bay stretch, that mile-long stretch that we've been talking about, covered up homes, brand new homes that were 75 feet or more from the ordinary high. We now found that was an error, and those homes are no longer mapped in the VE zone. But I just wanted to bring that distinction in because I know we've been tending to talk about that scenario, and hopefully many of these homeowners, property owners will have some options. I can't guarantee that, of course, but looking at the maps, you can get a better perspective. For the most part, this VE zone was fairly close. I don't know if we can approximate. When we were talking to the engineer at our meeting this summer, they were talking like 30 feet. And they didn't go off of the ordinary high like we're used to talking about in terms of setbacks. But I just wanted to kind of put a general disclaimer out there that it's not the entire lots for the most part that are covered.
But you might have a different reaction to this, which is, and it could happen anywhere, where you have older homes and an empty lot in between, and they fall into the VE zone, and now you're going to have two homes at grade and a home that's going to be on stilts. I mean, that's going to be, there's obviously going to be some rub from the adjoining neighborhood about the fact that you're impacting, if nothing else, the property value potentially.
We see it in the Mississippi all the time. I'm not downplaying, but we do see it on the Mississippi because like the one I showed you was fairly new and there'll be a cottage right next to it. And go ahead.
And I'm the one that asked the zoning administrators to only identify existing homes, not to worry about the vacant lots that were out there, because like Sue said, for the most part, when you start looking at these maps or when you look at them online, it's a blue strip that kind of looks like it just covers up the shore and a little bit in. It doesn't go, and cover up entire vacant lots. So our hope was that for the most part, most people that have vacant lots are gonna be able to build outside of that VE zone. But you're right, that might mean that in some places, you're gonna end up with a house on stilts next to houses that aren't.
And I know you've been with your hand up.
They've taken away the VE designation for Lake Forest Park Road, but the map still shows it, is that correct?
Right. What you come on the website, the greatlakes.org, still shows that map with the inaccurate.
The dotted boundary lines, that's the shoreline, that's not, when they show the map and then the blue line's in, they're going in on the shore.
They're going into the
Okay.
shore, correct. So that's still showing the original map they gave us with the homes covered up.
So they haven't changed that.
Right, they had given us a letter describing that error and talking about our comments that we had submitted in September. And at the back of that letter, they gave us a map showing what it will look like, a draft.
And we still don't know the difference between the 240 and the 120. The figures they're using, we don't understand what they're
We
trying
don't know
to
where they
say.
measured from.
We don't know where they measured from, correct.
And getting to the point of on Lake Forest Park Road, there's a lot of surveying being done. There was a lot of offers to buy real estate. The surveyors came out and did a lot of lot lines in anticipation of selling property, and that fell through. Plus, Public Service contracted with another surveying company to see the potential for putting gas lines out there. So they,
So that's.
So there's
that answered whoever
there's your
the
answer
question
to the surveying.
Yes, they did that all the way from the.
New lines. I'll talk to you.
Oh, this is another.
The most critical decision that gets made in the entire mapping that the Great Lakes does is where the transect lines are and where the transition lines are. And the county has had a couple of times to influence that. Are there more times yet that you have to try and influence that? That's my first question.
Well, I don't know.
Not that I'm aware of. We did go through that. We did go through the placement scenario. Other than going through the appeal process, that would be the only other one that I'm aware of.
But that's not something a homeowner can easily appeal.
No.
No,
That's
I think
something
what
that-
you would need to do, so I'll back up and just make sure everybody understands. So in 2012, when we first found out that this study was happening, and like Sue said, they asked us to look at the transect lines that they had picked. And the way the transect lines were, and actually, I think it was actually more like 125 that they had picked for Door County. What they explained to us was, as Sue said, they wanted to know whether where they had placed those lines, if those made sense to those of us that physically know this place, that there be a line there. So we, the zoning administrators and our mapping technician went through those maps, and like Sue said, some places it made no sense. You don't need 4 study points in Peninsula State Park or in Newport State Park. Other places, we could see absolutely nothing on the ground in terms of like a change from bluff to sand or to rock or whatever as far as or elevational changes. So we said, it doesn't look to us like this line is necessary. So we recommended, I think it was the removal of about 20 to 25, removal or shift of 20 to 25 of those lines. When FEMA did their study, they did remove some of them. They did shift some of them as we requested, but then others, I think they felt, nope, we've put this in the right place for whatever reason it is. So that's how the study lines got put in place in 2000, after our 2012 input. The reason we spent so much time at that point going over those lines was, as Sue said, we thought, based on what FEMA had told us, that it was possible we were going to end up with 125 different elevations with indoor county to regulate, and so we were going to have to explain on our 300 miles of coastline where there's 125 different elevations. So we felt it was really important to make sure that where those lines were placed was as accurate as possible based on how they told us that they wanted them placed. So that was the input that we gave 5 years ago. In 2017, when they came back with the maps that are on the back table here and that you can get at online, they then wanted us to look at what they called transition lines, which are different than the transect lines. The transition lines are within the transect study areas, so each transect delineates a chunk of the shoreline that they're assuming is similar when they run their models, and then they move on to the next chunk. Within those, they somehow have transition lines based on what their models told them. They wanted to know in August of 2017, do those transition lines make sense to you? And that's the big spreadsheet that Sue and the other zoning administrators put together in September saying, yes, this makes sense, or no, this doesn't make sense. I think for the most part, we didn't comment on most of them. And then that's when we noticed the town of Sturgeon Bay stretch looked really out of whack for that whole mile long. So I don't know that they've actually moved anything or done anything with the input we gave in the fall. I know they've rerun the model and realized that there was a mistake on the town of Sturgeon Bay stretch. But
Within our comments, there are a batch of our comments that they will be repositioning based on the topography and the things that we've pointed out. There's a batch of comments that will be left as is, that they felt there were other contributing factors, not just the shoreline structures and or contours. And then there was the Sturgeon Bay stretch that they commented on, but I have not dove in to the details of all
so
the
I want to make it clear, because we've said this several times, we are not engineers, we're not surveyors, but I don't want you to think that we've been just willy-nilly giving FEMA input and that they've been saying, oh, okay, and changing things. We gave input based on their explanation of how those different points or transition lines were going to be used. We looked at air photos and topography maps and just knowledge of the actual shore conditions to say, okay, you've said it's based on this, but where you put it really doesn't make sense. Maybe it should be, further north or south or east or west or whatever it is. And then as Sue just reiterated, FEMA in some cases has said, oh yeah, you're right, or in other cases has said, no, there's a reason that we put it there. So I think we've been pretty thorough and careful in the input that we've given.
As a department, we did have some input as well. We were at the meetings, and I believe, I want to say the individual that's associated, the Association of Floodplain Management, had a representative there. His name was Al Luloff.
Yep.
He formerly worked for the department. He understands coastal analysis, so he actually helped the counties as well, not only Door County, but the whole process all the way up in Wisconsin. Al was associated, with putting those points and lines, so there was input, and it was Al's comments, I believe, it appeared to me, that caused that time gap between 2012 and longer, because from a layman's standpoint, the actual direction of the waves into the shoreline isn't necessarily at a perpendicular direction. You have to look at wind directions and what's predominant within the Great Lakes. So they went back and re-looked at things and more accurately represents what could happen.
I just realized I didn't completely answer the question about whether a transect could be moved or placed. I don't think there's the opportunity at this point to get one moved. Sue and I did have a conference call with a FEMA representative maybe a month or so ago, where she indicated that it would be, if we, the county, in the comments that we provided to FEMA, made them think, wow, maybe we really should add another transect study line here and break up a segment into 2 or 3 or whatever, that they would undertake that. She thought it was probably relatively unlikely that they would add their own transect. She did say that if a group of property owners wanted, or a town, wanted to pay to have an engineer do a new transect line, and then that would require redoing the modeling for however many chunks you're going to end up creating that would be new, that would be possible. But they would definitely, you would definitely want to pay close attention to what Miles said as far as selecting a consultant, and I think you would want to be talking to FEMA ahead of time to find out exactly what they would need as a product in order for you to develop a new transect study line.
Because what FEMA does is FEMA doesn't do this analysis. FEMA hires consultants to do this analysis. So those consultants that do the analysis can be hired by you or FEMA, you know, so.
Yeah. Does anybody have any other general questions? Otherwise,
Yes, if a property owner purchases federal flood insurance based on the current maps, do you know how long that premium that we would pay would be grandfathered for?
So one thing I forgot to cover is that once the maps go in effect, what happens is the bank, the lending institution will review all their portfolio and all their loans and see if there's anyone mapped in or mapped out. If you're mapped in, if you're newly mapped in, you will get a notice from your lending institution to basically purchase flood insurance within so many days. If you don't purchase flood insurance and you have a mortgage, they will place a policy on you. So if you do get that letter, it's in your best interest to do that right away. As if you have a current policy and you're going to be that grandfathered, you will be grandfathered, but you will have increment percentages that it will go up every year till you actually get to your the enforced policy rate.
Under the current federal flood insurance programs, are there upward limits as to what the feds will cover in terms of building and contents?
It's no, it's the same. It's 250 for the structure, 100 for contents, 100,000 for contents. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah. I mean, they'll only cover, you only can get covered
Yeah.
up to 250,000.
Yep. There is right now there is a threshold. I'm not going to get into a lot of political things, but there is a lot of talk that they may change those thresholds and to go up, but I don't know if that's going to happen or not.
we had 2 more questions, I think.
I've got a great concern on the notice. As you point out, these maps are not even drafts, right? They're drafts, they're not even preliminary. I mean, they can change in many directions. And a 30-day period is a very short window. Noticing something in the paper scares me that we may miss that. I just urge you, if you could, through homeowner associations or some way, find a way that the word gets out quickly when the new maps come out and when there are times that things happen, please.
We will. I mean, I think we do a pretty good job of publicizing. I mean, we're probably, are we one of the only counties that's doing something like this? We know counties that didn't even look at their maps or provide comment, and we're trying to give, like Sue said earlier, as much information out there now as possible. I think we can probably assume that those maps are not going to change a whole lot, because really right now, all they're, other than that stretch where they've said that they were wrong on the town of Sturgeon Bay, because they've said right now, they're in the comment period back and forth with us. Once that is done, once we have no more comments and they have no more responses to comments, then I think they'll probably consider themselves done with that aspect of the mapping for Door County. So if you're in a town or an area right now that you think is definitely going to be affected, then you may want to start talking to an engineer to
And
do
I
the study.
see across the state all different ways. You know, some will just do the minimum. Some will notify every owner in the floodplain. It varies across the state. You know what happens.
Well, as Jen has made apparent, I mean, we have been very caring and vocal that you've given information when you could and how you could. And we have this information, conduit going, and we would like you, and I'm sure you will, continue with any current information that involves the people who've showed that they are concerned. yes?
Yeah.
Well, I think your stretch, you guys are in the clear now.
I don't, see, we don't feel there's ever a clear. There's ever a clear.
By this and.
Because this was a whole new zone
Yeah.
created that never existed before, right?
So.
Not in this area, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this gentleman's had his hand up quite a while.
Well, that's okay. I'm probably in the same situation and all the people around Squaw Island are the same. I noticed that that red line right now takes up like about 20 feet of my, what I went through building up a wall, and I'm actually 6 feet above the water. So I mean, I feel that that shouldn't be floodplain. And I went through a big expense on getting my right-of-way moved, and now if it's still in floodplain, because on your new map, which I checked, I'm all in the red.
So we can look at that together. I know generally where you're talking. And when you built, you were in the Stillwater floodplain elevation. So, and I don't recall the.
No, I wasn't in it.
You weren't? Okay, so we.
Because I had an engineer come here from the Navy.
Okay.
And he told me what I should do because of that property next to me. You know how low that is.
Yeah.
And, it's gonna be the same situation. And I did have trouble because you guys did want to stop me. And I said, well, go ahead. And I says, I got the okay already. And, well, then all of a sudden, who was in your position, the up came out there and he says, hey, you can do anything you want. It was a
I'm
simple.
not sure exactly what situation you're talking about. If you're mapped in the floodplain, we have to regulate you as if you're in the floodplain. If you get a letter of map amendment or a letter of map revision that removes your property or your structure from the floodplain, then we don't have to enforce it. But we don't have the option of enforcing it or not. As Michelle explained earlier, this is a federal program. There are some state components. It's handed down to us to administer. I think we should probably wrap it up because Laddie's been recording for 2 hours, and anybody that's going to try and watch this online is going to have a heck of a time downloading it. But I just want to say one thing. When you're talking about the red shaded areas, it sounds like you're maybe looking at our current map and not the new study. So when you go on the county web map and you turn on the floodplain layers, that's showing you what we had to adopt in 2009. And as Sue indicated earlier, and I just want to reiterate this, there are some bright spots in this new study. For the most part, a lot of the county that is currently mapped as being in floodplain is not going to be in the floodplain anymore when these new maps go into effect. Yes, we are going to have this new zone, which is going to be odd for Wisconsin. That's going to affect roughly, we think, 120-ish property owners. Hopefully most of those property owners will have options. But a lot of the properties that have been paying flood insurance for the last 8 years will maybe not have to any longer, or not be required to any longer. The other thing is that, as Sue indicated, she's been working really closely with Miles on getting those 3 inland lakes, so Kangaroo, Clark, and Europe, mapped so that they are considered studied and they will not be paying as high a flood insurance rates as they are now. So that's, we think, happening. DNR and FEMA have basically said that that's going to happen. So there are some good things that are coming out of this. So, but I think with that, if you've got any more, do you have a question that's general, Dan?
Only because I'm trying to understand this, so I went and dug out the Lake Forest Park map, which you guys are all talking about. And then I just took a look at my own parcel down on Bark Road. I don't understand the difference in the map. If
It could be confusing, Dan, because it's existing with proposed at the same time, so we'll work through that with you.
So if the blue is off the shore, you're not impacted, but if the blue is on top of your property, then you are? Am I?
Correct.
Correct.
Yeah.
Because the map that at least that I appear to be looking at for Lake Forest, which is the unchanged map, the blue looks to be all out in the lake.
And the one map that was covered more heavily, that stretch just north of the canal, is not back there. I believe FEMA took that with them. They may have seen something as well as us. So that one is not back there. But I'm happy to go on any of these computers and show you your personal property and or any ZA. Go back there. We'll stay around and help you out here. Thank you so very much for coming.
Thanks for coming.